concept.
Welcome back to our series on object relations, thinking and theory and development. Today I'd like to speak about how our whole psychophysical beings, parts of us, interact or get divided and how we have impasses that don't allow. A nurturing psychic dialectic in the mind, and how that relates to self-integration at an early time in our development. Psychic dialectic can also be thought of in terms of the commonly thought of aspect of intersubjectivity that we speak about today, can be thought about as interpenetration between parts of the self, can be thought about in terms of interpenetration between the psychoanalyst and the patient in their emotional experience of each other, can be thought about as right and left brain having a dance and interaction together, doing the tango it takes two. Yeah, and we can think about it in terms of mind-body interactions, male and female parts of the self, masculine, feminine sides that the Jungians so much publicize. But it relates to dialectics back and forth between different parts of the self, as opposed to splits, fragmentation, impasses, and dissociation. So when we have early adequate self-integration, we should have more and more of this psychic dialectic developing. When there's a developmental arrest in the separation individuation period, what Winnicott called the transitional stage of development, and where we also think of self-integration in Melanie Klein's terms of the depressive position, where there's the transitional period and the depressive position and separation individuation. They all speak about this core self-development, self-integration, separation, individuation. And within that, there's the early object loss of the external mothering object. But if it's tolerable loss with good enough mothering through separation, individuation, then there's just this low-keyedness as sadness and the beginning affect of mourning and capacity for sadness as opposed to constant rage in a child. When the mothering is good enough, as Margaret Mahler said, there's just this low-keyedness, our beginning a capacity to mourn as a natural part of our development. And then we do develop psychic dialectic naturally. When we don't have that, we have developmental arrests, abortions in mothering, disruptions that create impasses in development, then we don't have the mother internalized in a way that nurtures all the ego functions, including this capacity for psychic dialectic. So whether you call it intersubjectivity, psychic dialectic, it's still an interpenetrating parts of the self, right and left brain interaction, whatever ways that you frame it. This is all dependent on having good enough bonding and internalization of the mother throughout all the phases of separation individuation that Margaret Mahler described, from differentiation through the practicing period through rapprochement, following an early symbiosis. That there must be mothering not only in a symbiosis, but a mother that can be attuned enough to the psychic location of her child when the child's becoming more autonomous and separate from her. There are many mothers who can't negotiate that because they don't have the psychic dialectic. And then there's either they're just seeing the child through then their own needs, their own psychic need of the time and where they're located psychologically rather than where the child is, and they can't go back and forth from their own feeling themselves and attuning to where the child is. So then the child can't develop psychic dialectic. So later on, though, when there has been this kind of developmental arrest, it can be repaired through an object relations psychotherapy or psychoanalysis, where there is reparative work that goes on through working with the early trauma, working with the real presence of the therapist, like Winnicott talks about in his writings, the importance of the therapist being there, as in the capacity to be a lone paper that he writes about, the mother or the therapist being there. Klein talks about in terms of the therapist as an interpreter being there that can become internalized to recreate a better environment inside of this, in the internal world. So Winnicott and Melanie Klein have particularly talked about this. And we have then a nurturing environment inside, and then there is psychic dialectic. But it's also that when there isn't that, and we have to work with it in treatment and work with the constant repetition of trauma and the sadomasochistic enactments that come up, then so much depends on the therapist being able to be attuned to where the patient is. And in order to help the patient express their affects freely, and also for the therapist to survive the most primitive rage and destructiveness towards a therapist that is expressed through feeling and words. And in that object survival, which involves, in Winnicott's terms, not retaliating or abandoning, or at least to a very large degree, not retaliating or abandoning as the therapist works and gets to know the patient. So this way, there is a reparative self and other dialectic that starts to take place, that starts to allow the patient to get from the rage that has to be tolerated by the therapist to the grief and mourning of the primal loss, whatever level that was. Wherever it was, if there's a developmental arrest in the self, it would be somewhere in that pre-Oedipal to mostly in the second year of life, in those stages, separation, individuation. There's a loss there of the mother as an external object with no adequate internal symbolic representation of the mother having been internalized, because she couldn't stay in contact and connection with the child well enough during separation, individuation, and those stages that Mahler talks about there. So when there's that disruption, it can only be healed and modified in a therapeutic environment, what Winnicott calls a holding environment, and what Wilfred Bion, who was a later Kleinian, called the container of the therapist being a container. Not only held the patient effectively by being present and sustaining presence despite the patient's rage and hostility and all kinds of affects, but also was able to process what was going on, to understand where the patient is, and ultimately be able to interpret to them. But a very important part is getting from object survival to mourning. And when the patient can mourn that primal loss and goes to intense grief affects along with rage, or back and forth with it, or after it, or sometimes the sadness comes after rage, sometimes the rage is expressed after some sadness. But the main thing is that there's a mourning process which involves more love than hate developing, so that mourning can be done and so that aggression can be modified. I don't like the word neutralized, but basically that's the idea, that it gets modified so we go from hostile aggression that's just reactive to more self-assertive modes of communication using our aggression as self-assertion. So all that depends on mourning, but psychic dialectic also will develop with the mourning process, along with all other ego capacities organically opening up through the mourning process. I have the theory about developmental mourning, so that's my term for this whole process, developmental mourning. And this is in all my books, from the ones on creative women, the compulsion to create, and the creative mystique, and also mourning spirituality and psychic change, a Routledge book, and the anatomy of regret with Carnett. All those 4 books particularly I have Klein-Winnicott Dialectic, where I deal with that too, coming out with Karnak, and a chapter on fear of intimacy, and a new Karnak book on fear, edited by Salman Akhtar. In those books and in all my articles and journal articles and book chapters, I always talk about the importance of developmental mourning for self-integration and separation individuation. Within that, I talk about the organic, natural development of all ego functions like observing ego, self-reflection, interiority in the self, sensing the interior world, and it beginning to be able to know that one has feelings and thoughts rather than just reacting. Being separate enough from our feelings and thoughts to know we have feelings and thoughts. Knowing we have interpretations, we become, in Thomas Ogden's words, interpreting subjects. Because we're able to know we're interpreting things. We're not just seeing what really is all the time. We're always adding things from our internal world and our affect states to the external world and making our particular idiosyncratic subjective form of interpretation. Once we can know we're interpreting, we can also become psychoanalytic patients who can take interpretations in symbolic form from the analyst. So all this organically develops through the developmental mourning process. And this is a very different way of thinking than ego psychology that focused on helping patients directly with functioning in the world. As an object relations theorist, most of the time, we're more focused on, of course, we listen to patients' problems functioning in the world, but we also are very, very much interested in how the patient is in the room with us, and so that we can help them have all their affects and get to this developmental mourning in our presence, so they have enough support from our presence in the holding environment to go through what's necessary developmentally to heal and self-integrate. And then all these natural ego functions open up. Psychic dialectic is a very important one because it involves talking of different parts of the self, so we know we're having conflicts within the self and don't always feel like we're just reacting as victims to things out in the world. We start to realize we have different parts of ourselves that need to speak to each other to resolve internal conflict. And that's all part of psychic dialectic. And it's a very important part of intersubjectivity and interpenetration of self within the self, and self and internal objects within our internal world, and self and other within interpersonal relationships. It's also the essence of both sexual and psychological intercourse, and problems with intimacy would involve impasses and blocks to that kind of interpenetrating dialectic between two different people. And it directly relates to any impasses or blocks in the internal world, where if you can't relate to parts of yourself and to the others inside of you, then you can't relate to another in the external world. So originally we internalize interpersonal relatedness with the mother at the primal stage, and then we build in an internal world. Then later we have to have intercourse with our internal world to develop interpersonal relationships outside and to nurture them to the point of intimacy and sexual and psychological intercourse, and emotional intercourse, intellectual intercourse, all kinds of intercourse with others interpersonally. So developmental mourning allows that capacity to open up, along with naturally, organically developing self-reflection, interiority, observing ego functions, and all the things that the ego psychologists might talk about for functioning, but it's happening organically, naturally, through an affect process of the person being able to express their affective true self in the room with the therapist. Okay, so this is the main point that I wanted to make today, that we have an organic development resuming when there's been any developmental arrest or a basic disruption with our self-development. It can be, our development can be recreated through the patient being able to be in a holding environment with a therapist who's effectively present, who can nurture this more development of mourning, and that leads into the organically flourishing ego functions, including and especially psychic dialectic. Thank you, and to be continued in other ways at other times. Thank you very much.